Hi, well, welcome everyone. My name's Don Harrison. I am pleased to welcome two authors in front of us who are here to discuss their book, The Fourth Revolution, The Global Race to Reinvent the State. On my far right is John Micklethwait, who is currently the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Which one of you, in their 19th year, 20th year, took a road trip across the... That was you?
That was me.
That was you? You didn't edit? So I just wanted to highlight that that was an important road trip, which had a formative sauna at the end of it with Milton Friedman. Did that lay the ground for this book?
I should explain. When I was aged 18 in Britain, you take a gap year before you go to university, and I came to California, possibly quite a long time before many of you here were born, in 1980. And I went to go and stay I was traveling around with a friend, and I went to go and stay with a cousin of his, an elderly man called Anthony. And we stayed in his apartment block in San Francisco. And he persuaded us to go and have a sauna around the corner with his neighbor, a man called Milton. And I sat there, and Milton asked me what I knew about Margaret Thatcher, and neither me nor my friend really knew much about it. And he kept on saying how the world would change, that British Rail would be privatised, that British Leyland, this old car company, would be broken up, that Margaret Thatcher would introduce education vouchers, that something called monetarism. And I was aged 18, 19 at the time, and I thought this man was basically on drugs. I looked at him and I thought, this is completely weird. I've just come from Yorkshire, part of northern England, and we've had lessons by candlelight because of the miners being on strike. And later that week, I went to go and watch the Grateful Dead play in San Francisco.
That's a rock band.
Nothing that I saw then seemed half as hallucinogenic than what I had heard in the sauna. And yet that was Milton Friedman, to my somewhat junior self. And actually, in some ways, it's a nice way into this book, because this book is an attempt to say to people, you may think that government will never change, but it can change very, very dramatically. And in fact, in terms of the revolutions we talk about in Western government, what's interesting about the Milton Friedman revolution is we say the revolution of Thatcher and Ronald Reagan wasn't really a whole one. It was just a half revolution. And what we argue is that if you think that you should be despondent, and you can see lots of people who are going to troop off to the midterm elections in November, and if you think of all the people who are going off to vote in Europe this week, there's a sort of despondent apathy there. And what we argue in this book is that is completely wrong, is that all the evidence of history is that government will change dramatically when it needs to do so. And the West has been through 3 huge revolutions like this. But also, very much to your world, is that technology changes things. If all of you, and I find this incredible that anyone on Google could think this, but we do get this reaction sometimes, people tend to think that they seem to somehow assume that all this change that has happened to the private sector somehow won't happen to the public sector. And we argue that is exactly the opposite. Every huge revolution government has been through, technology has been right to the fore. So that's a long segue from your sauna. But that is the message of this book, that change is coming to government in a much, much bigger way than people have thought, but with one twist, and that is that this time you are in competition with China and with Asia and with other places which are working much harder on government than the West is.
Great, well I appreciate that you dove right in there. At Google we like to sort of dive right into and sometimes throw the PowerPoint away. So I'll punch through the rest of the introduction quickly and then we'll get on with it. But I note that you studied history at Oxford. You had a productive career as a banker, close to my heart. But then unfortunately became a journalist in 1987. You were named editor of the British Society of Magazine Editors in 2010. And I assume both of you guys are friends of Google. I've seen a picture in the book and some notes that seem friendly in the text. And on my immediate right, Adrian Wooldridge, who's the management editor for The Economist and writes the Schumpeter column. Pronunciation, okay? Good. And he was based in DC, where you were the Washington bureau chief. So you jumped in and sort of explained the basis of the book. I want to say that my impression of your book or what really stuck to me was the call to action that you described. You offer ideas, you offer a clear roadmap, but what I sort of found interesting, both the history, but also the clear engagement you outlined. Mill, Webb, Cromwell, Richelieu, Gladstone, all engaged, all with a sense of mission. We do have this apathy towards democracy, but you try to make us not despair about that and to provide examples of how we move forward. Was this, you have a roadmap of action, and then you also have a call to action. Are both part of the book? Is one more important than the other?
Can I start off by saying what the revolutions were, just to give people a sense of why we're saying that there were revolutions? Because we tend to think, we can quite often think that the state is just something that's there, or something that we can ignore. And what we argue very much in the book is that the state has, for the past 500 years, been a key to the competitiveness and the competitive success of the West, and that the state has constantly evolved, and it's because it's evolved that the West has managed to stay ahead. If you go back to the year 1500, you would find that everybody in the world who wasn't completely deranged would have thought that the future of the world belonged to China. China was much more dynamic, it was much bigger, it was a much more concentrated civilization than Europe was. Europe had 3 cities which had more than 300,000 people as inhabitants. The Heavenly City in Peking alone had inhabitants of 300,000 people, many of whom were civil servants who were selected by objective examinations, the most sophisticated examinations the world had ever seen, from the whole of the empire to administer this great empire. So Europe, by contrast, looks like a sort of blood-soaked battlefield, a backwater, where you're constantly fighting over religion, you're constantly being bullied by nobles who all have their own private armies and are wandering around in a rather lawless way. And the way that Europe gets ahead is first of all inventing and then reinventing the state. The first thing Europe does is invent the state as a security state to provide public order. That's the fundamental thing that the state should do. So you have a public order revolution whereby the nobles are brought under control, religion is brought under the control of the state, so you don't have any dissent over religion. So public order, but at the same time, a certain measure of competition between all these rather coherent nation states. They're competing with each other. In China, the system is so big, the empire is so big that it's very introverted, it's very inward-looking. When the Chinese invent gunpowder, they use it to create fireworks. Probably a nice thing to do. We, in Europe, use it to create weapons, to blow people out of the water. When the Chinese are confronted with the possibility of trade with the rest of the world, the emperor in the mid-17th century says, actually, to all the people who are on the coast, the southern coast, which is the most prosperous part of the country, you must move inland. You mustn't mix with those people. It's an introverted middle kingdom. The Europeans, on the other hand, trade with the rest of the world, conquer the rest of the world, create a dynamic and rather imperialistic civilization. So Europe pulls ahead because of this invention of the competitive nation state. Then in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have a sort of liberal revolution, whereby you have a liberal state created that's accountable, that's efficient, and that's much smaller. So you have a contraction in the size of the state, because the state goes from being a rent-seeking organization, which basically deals in sinecures, offers sinecures to employees, employs them for doing nothing at all, to saying, actually, we'll select civil servants on merit, we'll solve problems, we will create a prison system, a police system, solve the basic problems of an industrializing society. So that's the liberal revolution. And then in the early 20th century, because people begin to complain that this is a rather hard-hearted vision of the state, they begin to complain that the state needs to do more to encourage economic dynamism. You get an expansion of the role of the state, starting small, starting with the notion that the state should provide a guaranteed minimum of civilized life, education, welfare, retirement payments. But then the ambition for the state gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the Labour Party in Britain in 1945 talks about building a new Jerusalem. Today is absolutely the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, when he said we must create a great society and use the state to get rid of racism, get rid of poverty, get rid of discrimination. So a more and more expansionist view of what the state could do. But that vision, we think, hits the buffers basically in the 1970s because of over-expansion of the state. You get a reaction against that under Reagan and Thatcher, who say we've got to contract the state a bit, but that doesn't really work. They do important things. They get the state out of running businesses, like British Rail, British Leyland, which they shouldn't have been running in the first place. They get the industrial relations much more sorted out than it were, but the state continues to expand. And what we're now arguing is that we're at the beginning of a fourth revolution, driven by a number of forces which we'll talk about later, but essentially which gives us a chance to reinvent the state in just as dramatic a way as it was reinvented in the 16th century, in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century. And we need to do that.
Sorry, you've gone to sleep. No. I was trying to think if I could relate that back to the original question. Do you think, though, that that there was a great quote in the book that talked about it didn't matter what system we had as long as it was well administered. Do you believe that? Do you actually think that there's qualities that allow our systems to operate, or are other better systems?
No, I think at the heart of what you are seeing now is you've seen a state which has grown, it has got far too big, it tries to do too many things, and you've ended up with this nightmare where both the left and the right keep on adding to it, because the left adds hospitals and schools, the right adds prisons. California is one of the great examples of that. And both sides keep on asking for more, and we've ended up with regulation and a complete sprawl. One of the founders of the welfare state was Sidney Webb, Beatrice Sidney Webb, the first sort of Fabians. He was the son, his mother was a hairdresser. You now go to Florida and you discover that you need 2 years in order to become a hairdresser, to get a license to be able to cut and blow dry. Even Sidney Webb's version of Leviathan possibly didn't stretch that far, let alone the idea you need 2 years to become an interior designer. And whatever vision of the state, or if you look at John Stuart Mill, Locke, Thomas Hobbes, they never said the state was set up to prevent clashing colour schemes, perhaps a bit like these, in your living room. So there is a core to this. There are two big things. One, can you run the state better? And there we have absolutely no doubt that should appeal to people of any political persuasion. It should appeal particularly, actually, to most of the people in this room, because there is a huge amount of technology in that. There is a whole variety of things the state does which are completely out of date, which we can come back to. But then there is also an ideological question, because making the state do all the things that it does at the moment much better is sort of obvious and should be done much more aggressively than it is. But you also have to go back and ask these fundamental questions. What is the state for? And at least part of the aim of this book, or at least part of the pickup of it, seems to be that people, America, Britain, and the West, who have not thought about political theory, they've not thought about what Mill said, about what Hobbes said, about what people like the Webb said, have come back to ask those questions. In a strange way, you have a governor here, Jerry Brown. He does actually think about those things. But time and again at the moment, people aren't thinking. And our personal answer is what we would describe as a liberal one, is you have to take the burden off the state off people, so in order they can do much better. But we think by doing that, you could definitely leave far more room to direct programs towards the poor. You can make the state much more efficient. So there are those two bits. One is managerial, make the state work much better. The second is ask yourself the fundamental question, which actually politicians don't at the moment, is what is the state fundamentally for?
So talk a bit then about what forces you think are coming to bear that's creating the current crisis.
Adrian, you go.
That are creating the current crisis or creating the opportunity for change?
A crisis is always an opportunity for change.
Good. I think the most obvious thing that's creating the current crisis is the fact that we have an explosion of entitlements of public spending that is really unsustainable. That we had the 2007 economic crisis, and since then we've pumped. Public debt has gone up by, I think McKinsey calculates it's gone up by $13 trillion. $14 trillion, says John, he's wrong, actually. But before that, these trillions were multiplying. And what we have, the whole Keynesian notion of the function of the state was that the state should step in at a time when private sector demand declines, a time when you get recession and potential depression, and it should step in to stimulate the economy. Since 1960, America has run surpluses 5 times. Since 1975, France has run surpluses 3 times. No, France has never run a surplus since 1975. And I think what you have is a situation in what was once supposed to be a crisis-fighting mechanism has become something that you do all the time, constantly stimulating the economy in a way that I think is dangerous. It's like constantly taking steroids, constantly taking drugs that stimulate you, rather than taking them to deal with an illness. And this addiction to debt has happened at a time when the age profile of the population is getting worse. You're getting demographic change, so the population, particularly in Europe, is aging, but also in America you'll have the retirement of this huge baby boom generation. So I think necessity is driving a lot of the reason for the reinvention of the state. Secondly, I think there is a huge opportunity to do things better. If you look at the state, managerially, it looks as though it's in a different century from the century of even I work in, even I live in, let alone you people at Google. If you look at the school calendar, it's 180 days. America has one of the longest summer holidays in the world, during which time I think most school children forget everything they've learned. And the reason for that is so that the children can go and harvest the fields. It was an agricultural calendar created to free children for harvesting. Also, you have a lot of industrial sort of logic working in the state. It's driven by the idea that vertical integration, that controlling and owning everything that you do is the best way of managing things, which is the way Henry Ford thought about production in the early 20th century. It's not the way that private sector companies operate anymore. So managerially, there's a lot of room for improvement.
I'll just come in and interrupt there very quickly. Is that one example we actually use is this building. We say, look at the difference between Sloan's headquarters of General Motors back in the 1950s. These huge buildings in the middle of Detroit, which had the chairman at the top. They had rows and rows of people downstairs. Now come to Google. You see a complete change, a devastating change in the way in which companies are organized, the way that companies are orientated. Now go and look at government. Government has not changed anything. Sorry, there's a voice here saying clearly we don't understand Google. It may be just as hierarchical and indeed autocratic, but it is at least done under a veneer of communal action, and that is perhaps the way government should work. But no, it isn't. It is fundamentally different. You don't have rows and rows of people where you advance by seniority based on age, but that is still the way that the state fundamentally works. And so when Adrian's saying it's out of date, it's not just in the agricultural bit. A lot of it is back in the Henry Ford era, and a lot of it is back in the 1950s. And so we're not saying you have to do anything dramatically radical just to bring it up to the same levels, but there are some radical things you can do to do with technology. And I've interrupted my co-author.
Well, obviously, the other big prompt is technological innovation. And for me to talk to you people about technological innovation would be rather like me going to the 49ers and talking to them about football. But I do think that we are at an extraordinary time in history, that in the 19th century, the manufacturing revolution hugely increased productivity. And I think that you can have exactly the same revolution. You are having exactly the same revolution in the service sector, whereby you can increase productivity. And the state is fundamentally a service sector occupation. And one of the great arguments about the state has always been that you can't really improve productivity because it's so dependent on human labor. And there's a great economist called William Baumol who invented the notion of something called Baumol's disease, which is essentially that productivity in the in the service sector cannot increase. And his argument was that you, to have Beethoven's string quartet played when Beethoven was alive, you required 4 people. To have it played now, you require 4 people. So you're absolutely stuck with the productivity problem. And I think that, in one sense, that's obviously true, but in another more important sense, it's not true. Now you can listen to Beethoven's string quartet, you can listen to all the music in the world, virtually free, at an incredible quality. And I think that logic, the logic of the digitalization of information, means that you can begin to introduce the sort of productivity improvements that you've seen in manufacturing to the service sector. And that means you're fundamentally changing the nature of the state and fundamentally removing a constraint on the nature of the state that you've seen before. So I think that this combination of the pressures, the prodding from fiscal and demographic things with the opportunity to do things radically differently because of the nature of information technology. And finally, a third thing is global competition. I started off talking about the way that the state has been dominated by the West for the last 500 years. The West has been the place where all the big ideas and innovations have come from, and that has kept the West ahead. Now, we're seeing something very new, which is lots and lots of really good ideas are coming from the rest of the world at the time when the West is paralyzed, I think, and rather gridlocked and intellectually perhaps run out of steam. Other parts of the world are coming up with new ideas. Brazil coming up with the notion of conditional cash transfers, which introduces incentives into the welfare state. The Indians coming up with new ways of running hospitals and getting medicine and healthcare out to rural areas. And above all, China coming along and challenging the two fundamental ideas of the West. The fundamental ideas of the West is that government should be out of industry, should be out of business. Well, they've invented this notion of state capitalism, injecting government back into the heart of business. And the second idea is that democracy works. Democracy is essential for circulating elites and that sort of thing. And they say, no, actually, you can have a top-down, Mandarin-style circulation of elites. So they're really going at the very fundamental ideas of the West and say, we've got a new model, it's better, history is being forged by us, the West is left behind.
One of the examples you gave in the book that actually resonated with me was the Khan Academy example, as a chance to, we're seeing things like Uber and ride sharing, where software is allowing us to sort of reimagine services that we've taken for granted for a long time. The education one is interesting. You think we're at a inflection point where we can see, productivity gains and things we've said, 20 students a teacher, that can get much, much better.
I think that's true. I think that you tend to, as you know better than most people, with the technology, people tend to exaggerate the short-term gains, but then get the long-term gains, underestimate the long-term gains. And I think if you could see what's happening in education beginning, the Khan Academy is interesting. Bill Gates, who I know is a very popular man here, he makes his children do their homework with the Khan Academy. That is something, he's the world's richest man, but that is something which is open to all of us. And what is happening in education is making it possible for star lecturers to reach ever more people. You're no longer just wedded to the person you have to listen to, the chalk and talk variety. And yes, it's going to take time, and yes, you've got these huge barriers to do with the teachers' unions, because actually what we're talking about, I said that the managerial revolution is apolitical, but actually you think about it, it does pose really substantial problems. I would argue it poses substantial problems, possibly slightly more for the parties on the left. And to use here the example of the Democratic Party, they are going to have to make up their mind, and you can see this with Hillary at the moment, really wrestling with this, is does the Democratic Party exist to try and help the lot of the poor, or does it exist in order to protect the public sector workers who are its absolute core beneficiary, absolute core supporters? Because if you believe any of these things about education, then that could be amazingly good for the poor, but much less good for the teachers' unions, which, as we know, about 1 out of 10 of the convention members of the Democratic Party. It's not just for the left. In this book, we are equally tough on the right. We think the Republicans have two really huge problems in trying to deal with this. We see ourselves very much as a sort of centrist manifesto, a very radical manifesto, but one aimed at the center. The Republican problems are two. The first is they have got to take the state seriously. The most perfect example of the Asian alternative is Singapore. Virtually every single thing, every single government service that you compare America and Singapore provides roughly 2 or 3 times better service. They're usually about half the cost. A little bit of that due to authoritarianism, a huge amount due to better management. Singapore pays people at the top $2 million a year to run it. They do what any private sector person would do. They think there's a huge problem running schools, running your administration, running your civil service. If you do a good job of that, we will pay you a huge sum of money. At the moment, it's inconceivable to imagine any Republican senator standing up and saying, I think the civil servant in charge of the Pentagon should get paid $2 million. Even if that man could save you billions, they wouldn't do it. So you have got to take the state seriously. At the moment, the modern Republican Party doesn't really seem to want to. And the second thing is you have to fess up, if you are the conservative side of America, to the real problem of crony capitalism. Because if you look at the way in which you reduce the state, in the same way as Adrian talked about the Victorians in Britain reducing the state, the Victorians in Britain took a state, 1815, had £80 million worth of money coming in from taxation. They reduced it to £60 million 40 years later, at a time when Britain was the world's superpower, at a time when their population went up 50%, at a time when they added schools, hospitals, all the other things Adrian talked about. And they did that by ripping out crony capitalism. Well, the crony capitalism in America is the $1.6 trillion worth of tax breaks, virtually all of which goes to either the rich or to crony companies. And that side of it, the Republicans have got to deal with. There is nothing in Milton Friedman, that nice man I shared the sauna with, I was about to say shower, but there is nothing in him which says it's a brilliant idea to have mortgage interest reduction so that more money goes through that to the top 5% in America than goes through social housing to the bottom 50%. That is progressive politics gone mad, and it is a tragedy that the Democrats don't target that. It's a tragedy that the Republicans don't admit that that is big government via another arena. Look at all the money going to agricultural industries and so on and so on and so on. So yes, managerialism can sound sort of politically neutral, but once you actually start applying it, it has quite big political consequences.
So I think, and you touched on it quickly, in a book that I view as extremely pro-democratic, you do spend a fair bit of time talking about the virtues or some of the virtues of the Asian systems. Talk about the aspects that you like and the experiments you're seeing occurring in the East, and anything that we could emulate.
Well, I think the worst sort of race to be stuck in business is one in which you don't know the virtues and competitive strengths of your opponent. And I think we are in a sort of competitive race with the Eastern world, with the Chinese-centered world. And the most foolish thing we can do possibly is to underestimate their strengths. So I'm now going to present a view that is slightly optimistic or slightly praising of their strengths in order that we don't underestimate them. But I think they've done two things which are really remarkable and we should think about. One is that they've created a sort of state capitalism which is very different from previous forms of state capitalism. It's not a form of state capitalism whereby they own companies and have them run by bureaucrats, by administrators. It's one in which they own shares in companies. It's sort of equity-based state capitalism, and they have competition between various companies. They set up constant competition between telecoms companies, between IT companies. Even if they're nominally state-owned, there's a lot of competition going on. And secondly, they've set up a sort of top-down autocracy, which is very different from other forms of autocracies. Most autocracies die because the person in power won't let go of power. There's one guy, he's on the top, and he gradually gets older and madder and crazier, and eventually there's either a revolution or he dies. What they do is that they basically select this sort of Mandarin-style elite, and they have their job for 10 years, and then they have a peaceful transition of power to the next generation. So up until just before Modi, the Chinese leadership was significantly younger than the Indian leadership, despite the fact India is a democracy and China is not. So you have circulation of elites, you have competition between state-owned companies, but at the same time the state acting as a sort of guardian, trying to think in the long term. Now I can list, and I'm sure John will list, endless qualifications about that, the degree of corruption there is, the degree of self-serving there is, the degree of bureaucratization of companies that there is. But nevertheless, there is a sort of dynamism about that system which is really challenging the West, and that has grown up, that sort of dynamic sort of state capitalism has grown up at a time when our own version of democracy, our own version of capitalism, has got rather lazy, rather self-indulgent, and rather unattractive. So if you look at the period from 1945 to 2000, roughly, democracy spreads. The number of democratic countries relentlessly goes up and up and up. Then when you reach 2000, democracy stops expanding, begins to go down a little bit, but it's basically static since then. There are many reasons for that. But one is that China offers an alternative, which is attractive. And another is that people look at the West, they look at the European Union with its sort of huge Brussels sprawling bureaucracy which doesn't work very well, or they look at America and its incapacity to pass a budget, its incapacity to run the roads, invest in infrastructure, its incapacity to see schools, and they don't see the shining city on the hill anymore. They see something that doesn't work. So the attractiveness of the alternative model is going up, while the attractiveness of our model is going down. And why this matters, I think, is that we actually do want democracy and liberty to win the great battle of ideas. And if they are to win that great battle, they need to be much fitter and much more attractive than they've become.
I was struck by the idea that I think it was 7 years ago, that China told all of its telecommunications executives to essentially switch government, switch country. It'd be the same as Barack Obama calling up and saying, Mark Zuckerberg, you're going to Google, Larry, you're going to Apple, Tim, you're going to Facebook. Are there things like that you would like to see based in?
I mean, the story about this, John will answer this question a bit more, but the story about this is quite extraordinary, because one of the guys who was running one of the big telecom companies was in Hong Kong, and he was just about to do a big deal. Then he got this call and saying, you're not running this company, you're running the other company. So he had to go in and sort of renegotiate his position.
I love the idea of switching people around. I mean, the example, China, there are things right and wrong about the government, but the thing you want to think about is that they are competing. The thing we begin this book with is this place I visited on the outskirts of Shanghai, China Executive Leadership Academy. And it's a place where they send all their people who want to be ambassadors, who want to run state-owned companies. And you approach it, and it looks a bit military. There's barbed wire on the outside. And then you go in, and it feels a bit like Harvard, but Harvard as redesigned by Dr. No. Because
I.e. Stanford.
I.e. Stanford. But you have a huge red scarlet desk-shaped building in the middle, and there's an inkwell beside it, lots of dormitory buildings around it. And this is the place they send people to ask the question, what works best? Much less ideological in other parts of the Chinese leadership. People get sent there, and they are trying to do the same as they did with business. The Chinese think, well, 25, 30 years ago, we sent people to Silicon Valley, we sent people to the Midwest, we sent people to Wall Street and the City of London to learn about capitalism and to gain information to try and do things better. We're going to do exactly the same with government. But there's one really obvious twist, is they send people to Singapore, they send people to Chile, they send people to Scandinavia. They send people, yes, to some states. They were sort of rude about California, but they've got slightly more interested in it recently. They're interested about things that are happening in Chicago. But they do not send people to Washington. They do not see, all they see is dysfunction there. And that isn't just an ideological bias, it's also they're desperately looking for things that work, even at a micro level. And I think what would be foolish is to discount, even allowing for this book has a lot of examples of all the terrible things that are going wrong in Chinese government, but they are really working at this thing. And we, to some extent, are in the same position. This may be a slightly old version of this, and I'm sure you could probably think about it again. It's like the equivalent of kind of AOL sitting there, battling against another search engine and not really thinking about what Google was doing. The worst form of contest, perhaps a slightly better old world example, is Sears Roebuck sitting there battling Montgomery Ward, not realizing he was actually in competition with Walmart and then with Amazon. The worst competition to be in is one where you do not know you're in the competition. And that, I think, if there is a big sort of message of this book, it is that people have got to understand, both in terms of the opportunity, if America, Britain, Europe, the West takes up this to defend democracy, but also actually the threat, because there are other people who are actually taking this much more seriously than we are.
I'll turn it over to the audience for questions in a second, but let me ask one more question. Talk about the role that corporations play in this. I mean, part of the growth of the information economy is that companies like Facebook, like Google, Apple, Twitter can reach billions of people almost simultaneously. It's starting to play a role in how legislatures act and how laws are viewed. In your book, you sort of allude to corporations in the category of special interests. Are we a force of good, a force of harm?
The obvious way to be a force of good is for everyone at Google to send out emails to people telling them to buy this book, which would thereby engender the revolution that we need. But I'll leave Adrian to that.
Well, I think one thing we argue in this book is that corporations represent a way of running things which government can learn from. They're leaner, they're more efficient, they're more part of the 21st century than government is. But essentially, I'm not a person who believes that all we need to do is bring in Jeff Immelt, put him on a commission, and everything will be fine. Because companies have their own business to run, they can't also concentrate on running the government. What I do think is a fundamental thing is the purchaser-provider split, the notion that the state actually exists to make sure that everybody has access to education or access to healthcare or access to various public services. But in doing that, it doesn't actually have to employ the people directly to provide those services. It can buy services from a range of providers who might be internal to the public sector or might be external, and encourage competition and bring in people from all over the world, public or private. And I think a really interesting example of that is what happened in Sweden in the early 1990s. Sweden is sort of example everybody would think of big government socialism. And in the early 1990s, they had a complete rethink of the way they ran their state. And they decided, basically, to encourage welfare entrepreneurialism. They basically said, look, we believe in providing free education, we believe in providing free healthcare, but we don't believe in providing jobs just for the sake of providing jobs to the public sector. So they gave everybody a school voucher, Milton Friedman's great idea. They allowed private companies to run schools. They allowed chains of private companies to run schools. They allowed private companies to run hospitals. They didn't say, you have to be run by private companies. They said, compete. We'll give a contract to the person who runs them best. And that created competition within schools. It broke the power of producer interests like teachers' unions, and it spread good management practice. I went to a hospital in Stockholm, which was run by actually a private equity company on behalf of the government. And what you saw was that they were introducing total quality management, lean manufacturing, all the sort of things that doctors wouldn't instinctively think about. They were getting doctors who were sort of guild members almost to work much more creatively with nurses, with other members of the staff, because they were conceiving as their services as a whole. And they also, when they created this new management system, they spread it around all their other hospitals all around Europe. So good practice spread around Europe. So I think it's not that we want companies necessarily to run things, but we want to open the public sector to competition whereby private sector people can compete with each other, and the private sector can be more like the public sector. The other way around.
Adrian's hospital was free at the point, so you're free at the point of access. So somebody who goes there, it's free, but behind it there is a company. It's the contract between the government and the company.
Does anyone want to ask a question from the audience?
If you could hold on to the mic. Hold on.
Okay, Google's one of the best companies I've worked for, and one of the reasons is that it actually uses engineering principles for its management. And that's really unusual. I've worked at Apple, I've worked at a number of other places. It's unusual for management to say, let's do experiments and see what works. Ben Goldacre has suggested some really interesting ideas for your British healthcare system. Where they say, okay, well, let's do clinical trials, let's find out what's actually happening here. And he's been quashed regularly with truly sound ideas. So I'm curious what you think first of evidence-based management, which is what Google prides itself on, and whether that's something to do with it, because I haven't read your book yet.
I'll give you two answers on that. One, you are absolutely right. There is a tendency within, if you look at the civil service and you put it alongside the people in this room, apart from the civil service being somewhat older in pretty much every country you would go to, it's not a culture at the moment which rewards entrepreneurial thinking. If you're in the civil service, it's the same pretty much. It's amazing. There are one or two exceptions like Singapore, but pretty much if you do like we've done and you travel around the world and you see people, different government offices, you could tell within about 10 seconds you're in a government office, not a private one. And behind it, there is a general theory. You've got a job for life in most cases, and you've got a job for life unless you mess it up. And so it's almost exactly the opposite culture that you have here. That here you are here to take risks, to come out with new ideas. So you're right. That's why the Goldacre thing was squashed. In terms of evidence-based, I think that is a really interesting example about why people think this is never going to really take off. But you look around the world, What's happening is experiments are taking place. Cities have to start experimenting. Mayors have got to make the chances. And whenever people say it's impossible, just think of crime. When I was younger, you go to New York, it was an absolute nightmare. Look at every single number to do with crime. It's gone down, largely because people have worked out how to do it. And that was very much started in cities with Giuliani and Brasilia and other people like that. Look at the way that people are trying things at the provincial level. Google, I think, helps things with the District of Columbia. There's various things. There's lots more experiments going down at the bottom. And the other crucial thing, which is where the Goldacre thing comes in, is information. Because we talked about education. Yes, there's all these ways in which technology is helping education, but the most radical way is it's telling you how bad your schools are. You're all in California. You now know your schools are massively worse than Finland's. You've known that for the past 4 or 5 years, the PISA tests. The most recent PISA tests tell you they're not just worse than Finland's, they're worse than Poland's. So you are paying more money to get worse results. And the more that information starts going around, you can see it in things like Facebook groups, you can see it in things like websites which are devoted. And that is very much a kind of bottom-up revolution which is going to push this, I think. And you can see, again, Adrian mentioned Sweden. Another thing Sweden does is every hospital has to publish all its results online. So you can see. So again, it's about the internet just gradually working as a way to police the public sector. So you don't, yes, maybe the changes we talk about, maybe if a Bloomberg presidency came in, then maybe you would see a wide range of these things going through. Maybe there is a Thatcher or something like that who will push this through. But there is also just that massive evidence in front of people of how things can change at the bottom.
I mean, we talked a great deal in this book about the paralysis that is characteristic of Washington, and the fact that America really is not the sort of beacon that it once was. On the other hand, America, because it is this federal system, because you have so much initiative on the part of the states and cities, has also got lots and lots of great things going on. It just doesn't quite come together at the top. It's hard to scale up these things, I think.
So you seem to suggest that the technology is going to help things out because competition would increase, in transparency would increase. And at the same time, if you think of people as sometimes being foolish and inaccurate and easy to believe false beliefs, you can imagine that charlatans, for example, could take hold and false beliefs could happen. And I wonder what are the limits for this. So if we think about the FDA, for example, in the US, which is clearly a very bureaucratic organization, let's say we just canceled it and we let people just create whatever medications they would want, I suspect we would get much more fake medicine that would cost people lots of money and would kill people much faster. So I'm wondering, where is this belief coming from? And is there any evidence that openness and transparency is actually always going to lead to better outcomes?
I think it's a terrible example. I think that it's obvious nobody wants to get rid of the FDA. I mean, there's a big difference between wanting to get rid of the FDA is doing something transparently useful, and it helps markets, it helps a whole variety of different things. There are some that, I know there are criticisms about some bits of things the FDA does do, and it is useful to some extent that there's more information out there so the FDA can be held to account. What we're saying is, keep the FDA, get rid of the rules that say you need to spend 2 years training to be a hairdresser, because although I would worry about what kind of food you are getting. I'm not too worried about who cuts your hair, although it looks very good.
I mean, let me give you an example of why I think you're always is the problem with your. I remember I lived in Washington, in the early 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, and during that period, there was the public school system doesn't work, and there was a lot of pressure to introduce a voucher system and to introduce charter schools, and you would have parents, black, poor, impoverished parents who'd be queuing up outside schools to try and get their children into those schools because they knew those schools were better. Now, these people weren't making foolish decisions. They were making decisions absolutely well-informed because they knew the schools that their children were trapped in were useless, and they knew these schools provided better education. So in many, many areas of the public sector, the people who really know, ordinary people, are very well equipped to make decisions. You don't need to have an expert telling you. In fact, the expert is going to come out with a much worse decision. I think it's one of the worst things that Obama has ever done, was to send his own children to a private school, Sidwell Friends, whilst denying ordinary black children within Washington to be able to make a choice themselves. So my prejudice is that choice is quite a good thing to give to people, not to choose to legalize drugs that kill people, but to choose where they send their children to school, to choose what sort of public services they get from utility companies and things like that. I think it does add dynamism to the system and empowers parents.
So I asked you if you have any evidence. Is there any evidence that there's a domain in life in which giving people free choice is better?
Yes, I just gave you evidence.
No, this was a story about your own experience in Washington.
No,
It's considered evidence by me.
there's a lot. So it's rude.
And also
There's a lot of evidence about if you give people more choice in things like schools and hospitals. You can go. You've got socialist examples like we gave you Sweden as one example. You can look at the examples of education here. There's a lot.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Basically, my question is about how to increase political will to do some of these changes, because obviously you guys have written a book in order to start a movement, or maybe continue on, call it something more concrete. But my question is, it seems like we've had the information revolution for a long time, and that hasn't been enough. And it seems like you have to deal with a system that currently exists that would be opposed to a lot of these measures. How do you actually, get these changes to manifest themselves? Because I've heard some arguments about, well, at least from your talk, I haven't read your book, something along the lines of, democracy might be threatened, kind of like if aliens attack, humanity unites. But in this, that's one way to potentially create will to make some of these changes, but I think that there's huge obstacles. So how do you think we can actually make this?
I think some of them, as I said, is a variety of people seeing things happen. If you live in San Francisco and you see that LA has a much better system, you're going to start militating to get it. That's certainly what happened in crime, is that people saw what had happened in New York and they wanted more of the same thing elsewhere. It made a big difference. There's also, and I'm saying that there is now more information. So that's the general argument. It could be, as we say, it could be specific leaders arise to pull it. But the other thing which is worth noting is a lot of the problems of the American state aren't actually that dramatic. I mean, the one which everyone talks about is entitlements. But you look at the Simpson-Bowles Commission. They set off a group of wise men, so to speak, were set off to go and look at it. They came back roughly with the same answer as pretty much everyone has, which is you have to push out the retirement age. You have to put out the retirement age, push it up towards 70 slightly quicker. You have to do the same with Medicare. You have to do some fairly basic things. You have to do this. Tax reform is just sort of bleedingly obvious. We've given you, America has quite high taxes, particularly on corporations, but then it has all these ridiculous exemptions which just require huge amounts of form filling. And there is a sort of deal where you come through where you do tax reform, you do entitlement reform, and actually the basic budget begins to look much better. If Barack Obama had taken on Simpson-Bowles and said yes, I think that would have been a huge jump forward, a massive jump forward. And actually, I think when Obama comes to be considered by historians, and certainly when Obama is considered by himself, I think in 10, 15 years' time, when people are talking about the Bush-Obama years of splurge, where there was no attempt to really bring this problem under control, I think Obama will actually seriously regret that. It was, I think, a catastrophic decision, both in terms of American government in the long term, but also actually probably in terms of the Democrat Party, because it was a fantastic way to skewer the Republicans, because suddenly they were hoist on their own petard.
I think it's a great question you asked, but I do think that the speed and the impact of the IT revolution has really begun to sort of change very dramatically, particularly the way that you can possibly you can use IT to educate people. I think that you can the sort of the vividness now of lecturers over the internet. But I do think that it's not something that is automatically going to come because of technological change or just because people think that you can manage things better. We do argue that you also have to add a new ingredient to it, which is ideas. If you look back at all of these great revolutions, they've partly taken place because some group of people begin to argue that the state should be doing something very differently. I think the 19th century revolution of John Stuart Mill and the philosophical radicals in Britain was driven by a group of people saying, what should the state do? It shouldn't be providing jobs for aristocrats and sinecures for people. It should be solving these problems. It should be organized along a meritocratic, accountable lines. And the one ingredient which we really think that you need to throw into this, which means that the problem can't just be solved by Google and can't just be solved by McKinsey, is this big philosophical question: what should the state be doing and what shouldn't it be doing?
So it was in the Economist that I first read the term the Luddite fallacy, and together with the thesis that it has stopped being a fallacy, that information technology is destroying white-collar jobs fast and creates new ones. You might agree or disagree, but it's very clear that a lot of people in San Francisco agree. There's a very strong anti-technology sentiment out there right now in San Francisco and the country as a whole. And a lot of the fights about income distribution tie into this. People feel that they are losing ground, and it seems to me that this is a very difficult problem. If you address this problem, this might reduce the velocity of the West compared to autocratic countries. So, I mean, are quite happy to have inequalities. How do we solve this?
Very, very interesting question. Again, I think you have this phenomenon. I agree that we all think, we had a cover on it, that we all think that the speed with which technology is going to rip through services. I put this again to the lady who's in the same situation as I perhaps was with Milton Friedman, the sauna of not imagining how much these things could happen. You all find it very easy to imagine it happening to the private sector. It will happen to the public sector even more because it is patently overmanned. Productivity in the public sector has been so low compared to the private sector. I think you twist it both ways. If you take one of the great insights of economics, a profound statement by a man called Herb Stein, one of the great economists, said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. You apply that to inequality. All the people I wander around the world seeing in Europe, in America, Asia even a bit, inequality for a world leader is now becoming usually your second biggest problem. It's either inequality or fairness. And the problem is, even as economics struggles to do with it, and we all know what economies have to do about inequality, it takes time. So from a political viewpoint, you have this huge pull to the left, I think, in terms of people thinking about redistribution. You have kind of Piketty as one example of that. On the other hand, the other side of this is, I suppose, what we're talking about, which is the other thing which cannot go on forever is ever-increasing government. The one thing which has been consistent in every single person in this room is that we have all lived in an age where government has gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that is something that cannot go on forever. So if you can unleash productivity through that, you can also do enormous amounts of good. So on the one hand, you have, I suppose that is a pull slightly to the right to start thinking about different ways of dissembling government. The pull from the left in terms of inequality is another direction. So you're right, it's a huge thing. This plays into it, but it also provides, I think, new twists within it.
I think that it's a very profound question, and I think it's one of the most difficult issues of our time. There's somebody who writes a column named after Schumpeter who talks about creative destruction. I think it may well be the case that there'll be, for some people, a lot more destruction than creation in the future. But on the other hand, these very forces that are changing the occupational structure also create new ways of teaching people, new ways of training people, new efficiencies in transmitting knowledge. So many of these people who are losing their jobs, who are seeing their jobs displaced. On the other hand, the positive side of that is that they can probably be instructed in new jobs in much more efficient, much more up-to-date ways. And I think that there was an interesting example of a course that was recently taken over, which was created to train auto workers in Detroit to do IT jobs. And this had been basically run by the city, and it had been run very badly and had an incredibly low success rate. And it was taken over by Infosys, which has got an incredible internal training system to take people who are bright but not completely ready to do technical jobs and push them up to the level where they can do technical jobs. And it had massive improvements in the sort of results you have. So the very forces that are challenging us also perhaps contain the solutions to our problems.
As we run out on time, I'm going to ask a general question of you guys. We've had a bit of a rough month in Europe. We have a hard-to-understand decision by a European court on right to forgotten. We have the publishers rising up and trying to use antitrust as a cudgel to beat us down. Just a couple other examples as well. First of all, what do you think of us? And then secondly, how do we fix Europe?
On the whole, we've tended to back you in quite a lot of the antitrust things. The one angle where I personally am slightly, I'm nervous about is the issue of privacy, or privacy, as some people say. I'm one of those people who have begun to rethink exactly where I want the sort of parameters to be set. That on the whole, I want somebody who will have the default settings for privacy set relatively high, so people start from that angle. And I do think there is an element whereby I think at Google it's a fate you have, having seen many previous technology companies before, where this will become, I think, sadly, for better or worse, a great part of your life. I think the dangerous thing about what is happening in Europe is that there is a profound misunderstanding of how entrepreneurship works, and that comes through repeatedly whenever one dwells with the people who are making these decisions. And it's not just a question of Google and Facebook. It's more basic than that. You look at the companies that make up the more dynamic part of America, and many of you barely existed even a few years ago. You look at the equivalent in Europe, and it's a tiny proportion of that. And so, yes, there are individual issues where privacy, as I said, is one where I'm beginning to get more interested from actually exactly the liberal viewpoint that we champion in this book, because we think that is a vital fact. You can't just buy John Stuart Mill or Adam Smith on economics and ignore it when it comes to individual liberty as well. But overall, I think that there is a kind of slightly worrying attitude, especially from the Europeans, about this inability to understand exactly how entrepreneurship works.
30 of the top 100 companies, of the biggest 100 companies in California, were founded since 1970. The figure in Sweden, which we rather lauded in terms of its public sector management, is 2.
Thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it. Thank you.